thank you for coming out. And I'm even more thrilled to introduce our author, our guest author tonight. Jonathan M. Katz is a journalist and author. His first book, The Big Truck That Went By, How the World Came to Save Haiti and Left Behind a Disaster, was a PEN Literary Award finalist, and it won the Overseas Press Club of America's Cornelius Ryan Award for the year's best book on international affairs. Jonathan was the Associated Press correspondent in Haiti from 2007 to 2011, the only full-time U.S. news reporter there during the quake. He later broke the story that the United Nations soldiers likely caused a post-quake cholera epidemic that killed thousands. Katz has reported from more than a dozen countries and territories. In 2011, he was awarded the Foley Medal, thank you. I knew I could not do that one. Medal Medal for courage in journalism. Katz was a 2019 National Fellow at New America, and he's been a regular contributor to the New York Times and other publications, also appears on TV and radio, and he formerly directed the Media and Journalism Initiative at Duke University's John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute. He's here tonight to talk about his latest book, which was released in January of this year by St. Martin's Press, Gangsters of Capitalism, Smedley Butler, the Marines, and the Making and Breaking of America's Empire. Let's give Jonathan a warm welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for... It's on. Okay, cool. We're good. It's the live things that we do, right? I just want to say this is a phenomenal book. I have enjoyed reading it. I've talked to it, this is why I'm so glad we have this conversation, because my family and friends are really ready for me to stop talking about it. But we're only going to touch a tiny piece of the iceberg tonight because of how much is in this book. And I laughed when I got to the acknowledgments where your fact checkers, they said, the densest project they ever checked. Which tells you that not only is it dense, but there's so many eye-opening things in the book that I hope that everyone takes a copy home tonight or sends a copy out, because and I want to thank you for that, for illuminating some history that we may not know too much about. So we're going to touch a piece of that, and I want to thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So I just want to get a quick round of who has heard of Smedley Butler. Just raise your hand. And keep your hand up if you've heard of it before the WMRA announcement. Wow. Okay. There's still some in the crowd, though, that I think we should give a short synopsis of really who Smedley Butler is and how he framed Gangsters of Capitalism for you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for having me. This is wonderful. Thanks for the beer. It's really good beer, actually. Saison, I think. So Smedley Butler. Who was Smedley Butler? I wrote an entire book about that question. Smedley Butler was a Marine. That's the first thing that Smedley Butler would tell you about himself if he were here, which he is not because he died in 1940. But he was a Marine who joined the Marine Corps in 1898 at the age of 16 to fight against the Spanish and what is generally known in American high schools as the Spanish-American War. There are other names for it. And from there, fought in basically every major overseas conflict that the United States participated in, and there were a lot of them, from 1898 until the eve of the Second World War. But at the end of his life, he retired a major general, was twice awarded the Medal of Honor. He was one of the most decorated soldiers and fighters in American history. He called himself a soldier. Marines today don't like that term to be applied to them, but he actually didn't mind. But then at the end of his life, he became an anti-war, anti-imperialist activist who applied a version of the nickname that I used as the title of my book. He called himself a racketeer for capitalism. and said that he had gone around the world as a muscle man for Wall Street and the banks, for big business, basically pushing American foreign policy and the wishes of big American capitalists at the point of his gun. And then he died in 1940, basically trying to prevent the United States from entering World War II. We could talk a little bit more about that and the ways that his opinions about that may have changed over the months and years that followed if he had lived. And the last thing is in 1934, he blew the whistle on a fascist coup to overthrow Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So he was a lot of things to a lot of different people.
That's a huge, that coup that we don't know too much.
Yep.
I'm just going to go to your prologue here because you quote Michel Rolf Trujillo, a Haitian historian, who says, any historical narrative is a particular bundle of silences. I think that applies so much. Is why have we not heard much of Smedley Butler, and especially with what he lived through, the wars, plus why have we not heard much of these wars that you highlight in here, the Philippine-American War, Cuban, that starts with Cuba, all of these things?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and it's in a lot of ways, this book is a book about historical memory. The way I wrote it, for those of you who haven't read it, I hope you do, I went to all of the countries that Butler and his generation of Marines operated in to basically uncover the legacy of what they did and the historical memory that was passed down from their time. The easiest answer would be it was a while ago, but of course that isn't really sufficient. The Civil War, which was a war that happened a while before that, right? It ended 30 years before he first put on a uniform, is a war that, especially in this part of the country, and I live in Charlottesville, by the way, right on the other side of the mountain, so I'm in the area and I know of which I speak, is a war that often feels like it happened yesterday. These wars that he fought in, the Philippine-American War, the U.S. occupation of Haiti, the invasions and occupations of Nicaragua, Honduras, even the first war that he fought in 1898 in Cuba, those are wars that are all much more recent than other wars that we remember, but we don't talk about them. My theory, and I would be happy to entertain anybody else's theory that wanted to share one, is because we don't look particularly good in these wars. These aren't really defensible wars from a early 21st century standpoint. These are wars of empire. They're wars of the seizure of resources and the subjugation of peoples all over the world. And essentially, regardless of your political persuasion, with a couple of exceptions on the margins, it's very, very hard to justify those kinds of actions using the morality that we purport to have today. So I think that's a lot of it. It's also part of the problem is that when you go back and look at these wars, and you look at the way that their legacy is still alive with us today, and the ways in which they help to explain inequalities and the differences in the standard of living that we enjoy in this country versus the countries that we colonized, it becomes a lot harder to justify a lot of American foreign policy and domestic policy today. That's part of it. Yeah.
And for those of you who haven't been to a Books and Brews, we will have questions. So Q&A with you all. So you all will have, this is a community conversation and you will have an opportunity. So think about your questions. You were inviting some of those, as you're speaking, getting to specific, and one that's kind of close to you with where you spent time. Haiti invaded 3 times and you speak of it here, and occupied 19 years. Why was Haiti seen as such a threat to the United States?
Yes. So as I think you're getting at, I came to Butler through Haiti. As you heard from my bio, I was the Associated Press correspondent in Haiti. I was there during the earthquake in 2010, and it was as I was writing my first book, The Big Truck That Went By, that I went back to look at Haitian history to explain how things had gotten to a point that a magnitude 7 earthquake, which was the magnitude of the one that struck in January of 2010, it's a serious earthquake, but there's no real reason why an earthquake of a relatively moderate magnitude, as earthquakes go, should have ended up being the deadliest earthquake ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere. Between 100,000 and 316,000 people died. And you can't talk about that without talking about the weakness of Haitian institutions, without talking about poverty, and that requires talking about Haiti's relationship with the rest of the world. And you cannot talk about that without talking about the occupation of Haiti. As you said, it was 19 years. That was the longest continuous occupation that in the case of Haiti, the U.S. called it an occupation. That's actually the word that we used, that the U.S. government used. It was the U.S. occupation with a capital O of Haiti, which was a word that the Wilson administration pulled out to basically differentiate it from a colonial project. They were basically like, that's what the English do. Like that they colonize countries. We just occupy them for a little while. We just kind of hang out and then we're going to leave. That record was only broken in 2021, right near the end of the occupation of Afghanistan, which by that point, the word had taken on a uglier connotation, but that was undoubtedly an occupation as well. It was a foundational moment in Haitian history. Everything that has happened since the occupation ended in 1934 can be traced back in some way to. I'm not saying that Haitians don't have agency. I'm not saying that there weren't Haitians, especially the Duvalier dictators, who my wife, Dr. Claire Payton, has written extensively about, who bear a lot of responsibility for the horrible things that they did as well. But even the Duvalier dictatorship, you can't understand where the Duvaliers came from if you don't understand Haitian politics as they emerged from this period. Why was Haiti considered such a big threat to the United States? That's a huge question. In a lot of ways, that goes back to the foundations of both the Republic of Haiti and the United States. Haiti was, of course, founded in a revolution of enslaved people, the only successful slave revolution that ended with the both self-liberation of the enslaved people and then the foundation of a country that they ran in which no one was to be enslaved, although the first leaders of Haiti then tried to enslave some other Haitians, but that's getting a little bit into the weeds. And that example of Black self-liberation, of Black freedom, was a threat to the United States, which had just founded itself in a revolution that was a connected revolution. You can very much draw a line between the Atlantic revolutions in the United States, France, and Haiti. In a lot of ways, they were just sort of an extension of the same big war. But, to people like, our friend in Charlottesville, Tom, who was president of the United States when Haiti liberated itself and defeated Napoleon's army, the most powerful armed force in the world. The idea that enslaved people, that Black people could take up arms and overthrow their masters and kill some of them in their beds and throw others out of the country was the thing that did not sit well if your home was Monticello. I saw there's a My Monticello over there. Speaking of tie-ins, also a great book. And in a lot of ways, that memory of Haiti was still very much alive in 1915 when the United States invaded, when Smedley Butler and the Marines invaded. It had been just over 100 years. And all throughout the 19th century, the example of Haiti It was such a terrifying example, especially for white Southerners and people who depended on the plantation economy. They refused to even say the name of the country. They called it Saint-Domingue or San Domingo, using the old name that the French had for the colony that was overthrown. And a lot of Butler's fellow Marines had grown up in the South. His mentor, a guy named Littleton Waller Tazewell Waller, the grandson of a governor of Virginia, and had grown up in the Tidewater. And his first military experience was in I think it was called the Norfolk Light Blues. They were basically this was just after the Civil War had ended, but it was during Reconstruction and the beginning of the Redemption period. And, they saw their job as keeping newly liberated black people in, quote unquote, their place. Waller ends up running the ground forces in the invasion of Haiti. And Butler takes a lot of his cues from Waller. That's one example. There's lots of examples. But to a great extent, it was that, in their minds, negative example that they were fighting against. There were also other geopolitical reasons that they were very interested in it, and this is one of the things that it's one of the reasons why it took 5 years to write this book, and why my fact checkers called it the densest project that they had ever checked, because there's no single story to explain all of these things. There are lots of other ways to approach this. Haiti, geographically, was a key point on the route to the Panama Canal, which had just been completed, which is the subject of 2 other chapters in this book. If you look geographically, Haiti and Cuba are opposite sides of the Windward Passage. The Mole Saint Nicolas is the port in Haiti, and across the Windward Passage in Cuba is a spot called Guantanamo Bay, also the subject of a chapter. And so, to a certain extent, it was the Wilson administration was eager to protect its sea lane to this new canal that had just been completed. There were concerns that European powers, especially the Germans, might be trying to get a foothold in Haiti, which would, put a rival to the United States, just a couple hundred miles off of our shores. And Citibank thought that it would be a great place to make a lot of money.
I was going to say, there's a scene that you talk about that I've brought up to a number of people about the Marines going in and literally going into the Haiti National Bank and going out with the gold.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that the kind of gangsterism that you're talking about? I mean,
it's an unbeatable example. I mean, it's literally the United States Marines robbing a bank. I go into more detail about sort of how this came to be in the book. This precedes the occupation. It ends up sort of roiling Haitian politics. It results in the assassination of a Haitian president. The last time a Haitian president had been assassinated until the Haitian president was assassinated last year in 2021. Essentially, readers of the New York Times may be familiar with a series that came out, I guess, a couple months ago now. I'm starting to lose track of time. But basically, after France lost the Haitian Revolution, France, a couple decades later, with the acquiescence of a Haitian president, imposed a ransom on Haiti that said basically that the Haitian government had to pay 150 million gold francs, the equivalent today of about $21 billion, to make restitution to French plantation owners to pay for the freedom that the Haitian people had already paid for in their own blood. And the Haitian government was willing to do this because it was worth it to them to gain diplomatic recognition from France, because no one else in the world, in the Atlantic world, which was the world at the time that if you're in the Atlantic that you had to deal with, was going to grant recognition until France did. The United States didn't end up granting diplomatic recognition to Haiti until 1862, when Lincoln did it as basically an act of war. It was just a way of pouring it on against the Confederacy. And in order to manage that ransom, a French bank was given control over the central bank, or actually was given a charter to build a central bank in Haiti. The French who ran this bank were extremely corrupt, and so by the beginning of the 20th century, this became an opportunity for American bankers, particularly Citibank, then the National City Bank of New York, to jump in and become a shareholder in this bank. And one of the City bankers, a guy named Roger Farnham, who appears over and over again in the book, he basically put a bug in William Jennings Bryan, who was at that point the Secretary of State under the Wilson administration, his ear, and said, hey, I think this would be a great time to ensure repayment of our loans. Why don't we send in the Marines? And they robbed the bank. They made out with half the gold reserves, loaded them on a warship, brought them up to Wall Street for safekeeping. And as far as anyone can tell, and any of the historians that I consulted in writing this book, that money has never been returned.
See what I mean? We could be here all night. And we haven't touched any of the other chapters. That's just a couple of them. So let's move off of Haiti. Mm-hmm. And just before we turn over to questions, what is it that really, there was a couple of things I wanted to hit, but your unique approach of going to these places is really lovely, because you're back in time and then you're forward with you and your travel log. How did that help you to understand really the Marines and Smedley Butler, and also weigh the impact of that gangsterism or those invasions on the culture that you were visiting?
Yeah. I'm a journalist. I'm not a historian. My wife is the historian in the family. I was interested in this story. For its own sake, to uncover these histories just for myself, to educate myself about a period that I didn't know anything about, or knew very little about, and learned much more about as I was, undertaking the project of writing the book. But I'm also a journalist. I mean, that's what I do. Like, I go places, I talk to people, I describe what things look like and smell like and feel like, and I have experiences. And I wanted to bring that into the book. The other thing was that I wasn't entirely sure that there would be enough material on Smedley Butler. Ironic now, right? Yeah. But I just wasn't sure. I mean, this is a guy who lived 100 years ago. I didn't know, starting out, did he have a lot of papers? Would there be journals? Would there be a lot of his point of view to talk about? I knew I could do a lot of uncovering of the history. I could rely on secondary sources, but how proximate would this guy feel? Like, how immediate would this feel for the reader, right? From a narrative sense. He's a Quaker, I should have mentioned, and one of the fun things about him is that he writes in his letters to his mother and to his wife and ultimately to his children, he uses Quaker plain speech. He says thee and thy, right up through the 1940s. And actually, his family kept doing this until the mid-20th century. Ironic that a Quaker became a Marine, but then still thought that, as long as I say thee and thy, I'm still, living up to the credo. But he was a complicated guy. But I was like, so I knew that there were some of these letters out there, and I was like, this is going to feel really remote. Like, I'm writing, even if I'm talking about things that were happening in the 19-teens. Like, once you start throwing in forms of English that seem extremely archaic, that's going to seem even more remote. Well, it ended up happening that there was a ton of material, as you know, just feet and feet and feet of letters in multiple archives Big shout out to the people, especially at Marine Corps University at Quantico, but also at Stanford. His granddaughter allowed me to see some letters that I don't think anybody outside the family had ever seen before. And all of a sudden, I found myself in a different situation where I wasn't sure if the things that I was doing overseas were going to earn their place in the book next to the kinds of material that I was uncovering as an amateur historian in the archive. But I think that it did, and the reason why is because, and this goes back to Trouillot, as you were saying, Michel Rolf Trouillot, who wrote, by the way, a great book, if I can put in a plug, called Silencing the Past. It's a short book, it's a quick read, and it really will change the way that you think about history and what we know and what we don't, and how things get passed down to us in the present. In Charlottesville, where I live, maybe not in Charlottesville, people are talking about Charlottesville, there's often a synecdoche that history is just a bunch of statues, and that if you get rid of the statues, that you're somehow getting rid of history, and that's not true at all. Although statues do have an important place in history because they are a way of transmitting ideas into the future, real ideas and false ideas, but also the statues of things that don't get built are also history, and it's important to understand as a society what we remember, what we don't. And one of the things that was really interesting in doing these travels and writing this book and talking to people and exploring these different places was the ways in which this history that we have forgotten, that is often actively suppressed, is actively covered up, sometimes by Smedley Butler himself, like in his own lifetime, and then he did some things to recover it or try to recover it at the end of his life. But the way that history is then operationalized for sometimes not so great purposes in other places. Two of the chapters of this book, I go to China. Fascinating country, and wonderful people that I met and had a lot of great experiences there and met a lot of very welcoming people. But it has to be said that the history of the Boxer Rebellion that the United States played, and Smedley Butler played a major role in suppressing, of the White Terror, where basically the right-wing nationalists visited tremendous atrocities on the communists at the beginning of the Chinese Civil War in the late 1920s, when Smedley Butler also was there. It's a good thing to remember those things, and it's a good thing to carry that forward. But the Chinese Communist Party isn't remembering that history out of the goodness of its heart or out of a sense of obligation to have a complete record. They're doing it because the period that they refer to as the 100 years of humiliation is used in a very expressly political way. Basically, the message of the Chinese government in Beijing is, you may not like all the things that we do, but if you get rid of us, if you get rid of me, Xi Jinping, then the foreigners are going to come back and they're going to do the horrible things that the Americans and the Brits and the Russians and the French, et cetera, did during this period. So they're using it for their own purposes. And one of the things that I hope that I was able to do in this book is to put these different conversations, or put these different ways of understanding history in conversation with one another, and in so doing get a better picture of our world and also just the way history and historical memory are used. Yeah.
And I think effectively, because you felt that jump in time, as you've experienced it with Smedley Butler, and then suddenly you're there and you're talking to folks and you're getting a different modern day impact of that happening. So it's more real. And we are going to turn over, but keep in mind we haven't asked anything about the coup or lots of things. So I am going to turn over to questions from our audience, and feel free to put your arm up. Yeah.
Can you tell us about the coup?
Yes.
The question is, tell us about the coup. Thank you.
Yes. So in short, I'll try to keep this brief. My wife is laughing, I can hear her. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected president of the United States 1932. It is what will end up being the nadir of the Great Depression. And he becomes president March 1933. And in short order, essentially, powerful business interests in this country don't like him. They don't like any of the things that he's doing right from the start because from their perspective, he's going to be bad for business. He's going to be costing them money. He's going to be imposing regulations. And in the words of Irénée Dupont of the DuPont Corporation, he saw the New Deal that FDR was trying to implement as the socialist doctrine by another name. We're just a couple. We're basically a decade and a half out from the Russian Revolution, and from the standpoint of very rich people in the United States, they would essentially rather that everybody in the United States starve than have policies that they are afraid, sort of in their fevered imaginations, are going to end up bringing communism to America. And at this moment, it seems that liberal democracy has perhaps failed. Capitalism, as it has existed up to this point, has perhaps failed or is in need of dramatic rescue. And that to a lot of people, the only possibilities for the future are essentially either communism or fascism. And what happens is, in 1933 and 1934, a representative of a financial house on Wall Street comes to Smedley Butler and tries to recruit him for unclear. At the beginning of this recruiting process, he just wants him to basically go to an American Legion meeting and denounce FDR for having taken the dollar off the gold standard. But over the course of 1934, the ask gets much clearer. And by August of 1934, it is very blatant, according to Butler, that testimony that Smedley Butler ends up giving before Congress. This representative of the banking house, a guy named Gerald C. McGuire, asks Butler to lead a column of 500,000 World War I veterans into Washington for the purpose of intimidating FDR into either delegating all of his powers to a cabinet secretary whoever this guy was working for would name, or resign. And essentially, that would become the first fascist dictator in the history of the United States. Instead of going along with it, Butler testifies in front of Congress, blows the whistle on it, and is roundly mocked in the press. The press barons who are doing the mocking, a lot of them are friends with people who get implicated in this plot. And Butler, according to Butler's testimony, McGuire had said that an organization was going to appear in short order to back the coup financially with arms, and that this would be the American Liberty League, which is a real organization that is announced at this time in late 1934. And this was an organization that was founded by the DuPont brothers, along with Alfred P. Sloan of General Motors, the heads of Phillips Oil, Sun Oil, General Foods, et cetera. And the question is that has never really been answered, and I don't come to a well, you'll see if you read the book. I think I come to something of an answer, but it's hard to definitively say that the American Liberty League, at a minimum, was fully aware of some incipient coup that they were supposed to end up funding. It's certainly completely plausible that they might have been. It's also plausible that perhaps it hadn't reached that level of planning yet. Whatever it was, Butler testified, and nothing ever happened. FDR, basically all that he ever said about it was a one-word answer. He said, "fantastic," apparently when he heard, kind of sarcastically, you have to sort of imagine him saying this like with his, long cigarette holder and his translator, "fantastic." It seems that, he didn't want to take it any further. Probably because he had enough trouble as it was getting the bankers and these most powerful capitalists to sign on to, or at least not strenuously object to various parts of the New Deal. But yeah, it's known as the business plot. And it is the one thing that some people know about Smedley Butler. And the last thing I'll say about it is that I wasn't sure how much real estate the business plot was going to have in my book. I started writing this book in 2016. I knew that at some point I was going to have to deal with the business plot in some way, because like no one's going to pick up a book about Smedley Butler and have it skip over the business plot entirely. But as it turned out, I ended up writing the sections on the business plot. I happened to come to that part of my writing in January 2021, at which point I realized that, the big problem that I had writing Gangsters is that a lot of authors, especially when you're writing historical books, your publisher will say, you know, what can we do to make this book more relevant? And I just spent 5 years screaming at Twitter and the television saying, could you please stop being quite as relevant? I need a week off. Yeah. I hope that
We'll go to it.
Yep. So that's actually a misunderstanding. Prescott Bush, the grandfather of George W. and the father of George H.W. Bush, was the subject of a different investigation by the same congressional committee. His investigation was into actual direct collusion with the Nazis in Germany. Whereas the business plot seems to have been an entirely homegrown affair. So actually, Prescott Bush was too fond of actual Nazis in Germany to debase himself by getting involved in a mere American fascist coup. That's at least what my research found.
All right, let's play a game.
Yes.
So the question is, explain the successes of the Dominican Republic, then the failures of Haiti.
And now you know the game if you want to go to.
This is a long question. But I will say that I lived, before I moved to Haiti, I spent 2 years as the AP correspondent in Santo Domingo. So I'm fairly well versed in this. One thing that I would say is, and that I would caution, is that life in the Dominican Republic is not all roses. Sometimes too much is made of the idea that Haiti is an extremely poor country and the Dominican Republic is a wealthier country. The short answer, and this does tie into the book, and there is a chapter on the Dominican Republic in the book, because Smedley Butler also invaded the Dominican Republic in 1916. The man was everywhere. But it really does essentially come down to colonialism, and it really comes down much more to American imperialism in the 20th century than it does the country's relative experiences with European colonialism in the centuries before that. And without going just falling insanely down the rabbit hole, I would say that the Dominican Republic has had a much easier time submitting itself to and being operationally controlled by the regional power, by the United States, than Haiti has. Our last invasion of the Dominican Republic was in 1965. LBJ, who was busy invading many other countries elsewhere, most notably one on the other side of the world, ordered Operation Power Pack, a invasion of the Dominican Republic, which was meant to basically support it was essentially meant to support the protege of a U.S.-backed dictator who had been installed by the Marines, including some of Smedley Butler's friends, Rafael Trujillo. And his protege, Joaquin Balaguer, basically came back to power in 1965 with the full support of the U.S. military, which killed his rivals and destroyed Dominican intelligentsia and really immiserated the Dominican intellectual and activist class. And Balaguer ends up basically running the Dominican Republic for several decades after this, and does so with much more effective cooperation from the U.S. government because our guy was in charge. Whereas in Haiti, it is much more of a history of resistance. Even the Duvalier dictators, who were the dictators of Haiti at that time, had a much more tenuous relationship with the United States. There was a lot more push and pull. A lot of that had to do with memories of the occupation that had ended in 1934. There's many other things that are happening there. But the one thing that I would say is that it is extremely complicated, and don't believe Jared Diamond's explanation that it all just comes down to like tree cover on opposite sides of the border. But I do get into the Dominican Republic in the book.
I'm going to repeat the question. Did you make the final cut of the Philippine movie where you were a gangster?
Yes.
Did you get to see yourself?
Yes, I was a POW. Yes, I was. So I ended up in a movie in the Philippines about the Philippine-American War. It's called Goyo, the Boy General, An Batang General. You can see it on Netflix. At least last time I checked, it was there. And really, the centerpiece of the film is my appearance. Quite literally, if you fast forward halfway through the movie, I'm right there, and then it's about a second, and then fast forward the rest of the movie because you don't really need to worry about the rest of it. It's a very long movie. It's like a 3-hour movie. I watched the whole thing. Claire fell asleep. But yeah, I made the final cut. I think for a decade and a half, I had a very luxurious beard, which I've shaved off for COVID purposes, and to look more like an extra from Deadwood, apparently. But I think it was my beard. I think it was the fact that I was this bald white dude with a big red beard, standing behind the Filipino general in the scene, that really cemented my place in Filipino film history.
And who knew that following Smedley Butler would lead you to such a starring role, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to thank you both.
Yeah. Okay. How long you got?
And can you repeat that question? The relationship.
Yeah, essentially, I mean, if I'm summarizing this correctly, essentially what the research that I did in this book, what it tells me about sort of the emerging Cold Wars, as you put it, between the United States and Russia and China. Yeah, so I'll say a couple different things about it. One is, and I think that this comes through, as we were talking about earlier with regard to China, none of these things should be interpreted. Well, you can interpret them however you want, right? The author is dead, but here I am telling you that the author's preference is that you don't interpret any of this as absolution for any other government in the world, or really anybody else in the world. I mean, essentially, I learned as a child that 2 wrongs don't make a right, and that is still, one of my core bedrock principles that really hasn't failed me to this day. If we're talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you can put it in context of NATO expansion. You can put it in context of shock therapy and the things that the United States was doing, and Americans and American bankers were doing in Russia in the 1990s, and that sort of led to and precipitated the rise of Vladimir Putin. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this is Putin's war. He invaded Russia for his own reasons. his own greed, his own, frankly, racism or bigotry, his conviction that the Ukrainians are not a people or that they shouldn't exist. That's on him. What it does is to me, it complicates the picture. It means that I am not one who is going to just sort of sit idly by and listen to, paeans to, just sort of inherent American goodness and American democracy, and say, trust us. We're the United States government. We're the military-industrial complex. Everything that we do is right and trustworthy, and will work out in the end. It heightens my skepticism mightily about things that are happening on this side of the Atlantic and on this side of the ledger, but it doesn't provide for me any kind of absolution for Russia. Or, I talk about Russia very, very briefly in the book here and there. China is where I really go into much more detail, especially in the second chapter about China. The concentration camps in which the Uyghurs are housed, the atrocities that the Chinese government is perpetrating in Xinjiang, and frankly, the Chinese government's designs on Taiwan, which aren't going to do anybody in Taiwan any favors. And I really think that to a great extent, I try not to be either too presentist, to use the historian term, to basically only understand the past through the lens of the present, although honestly, to a great extent, of course, as a journalist, that's almost impossible. And I also try to not just sort of go back and project onto Smedley Butler my own preferences and my own thoughts. But I think that was essentially Smedley Butler's take as well. Butler, and I think this is one of the other reasons why Butler doesn't get remembered as much, was that he spent the last decade of his life as an anti-war activist. He wrote War is a Racket, which was sort of one of the first major works. It's actually a pamphlet, but first major pamphlets decrying what ends up being dubbed the military-industrial complex. But the war that Butler was trying to keep the United States out of was World War II. The good war, in quotes. And I put it in quotes because that's how it's often known. But a lot of parts of World War II were good, especially in Europe. If there were only two sides in Europe, there weren't really, but if there were only two sides in Europe, and you've either got to be on the side of the Nazi-led Axis or the American-led Allies, I know exactly what side I'm rooting for retroactively. Especially as somebody who, half of my family was wiped out by the Nazis. All of my family, with a couple of exceptions, that was still in Europe, was killed, and I have relatives, some of whom are still alive today, who survived the camps. Butler also was a strident anti-fascist. As his blowing the whistle on the business plot is proof. He was court-martialed. His military career ended in 1931 because he was court-martialed for having insulted Benito Mussolini. He was.
That's in the book.
That's in the book. So, Butler's answer at the end of his life was. That he was a big critic of his own country. He had become a big critic of himself, but that did not drive him to then become an apologist for the Nazis or an apologist for Mussolini, which a lot of people in this country were. That was a fairly popular position for a lot of the 1930s. And the America Firsters, the original America First Committee, frankly, from which Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon and the Trump crew got their name, a lot of them, for them, their doubts about the United States, their anger over the First World War, at that point the only World War, and their fears of, again, sort of creeping communism, and that the New Deal was going to bring sort of a Bolshevist wave to the United States. That led people like Charles Lindbergh, most famously Father Coughlin, the radio priest. That led them to just run avidly to the side of, well, maybe Hitler isn't so bad. Maybe he's got some good ideas. Maybe we could do business with him. Prescott Bush. That was not Smedley Butler's position at all. And I think look, if that had been his position, I would have had to deal with that in the writing of the book. It would have changed a lot of my appraisals of him. But one of the things that I think I really respect about him is in this period of self-searching and this period of rampant self-criticism and criticism of the United States and the things that the United States had done, that did not lead him to say that fascism is an acceptable alternative, or these foreign countries, should be allowed to sort of in a realist vein, as John Mearsheimer would say, that Germany should be allowed to operate in its own sphere of influence, give them the Sudetenland, give them Poland. What business is it of ours anyway? And one of the things that I wonder is, Butler died the day that France surrendered to the Germans in 1940, and he died 18 months before Pearl Harbor. And my supposition is that if he had lived, he died of cancer at 58, so he was still pretty young. I think if he had lived, he probably would have re-enlisted and gone to fight in the war. It's what all of his kids did, and his son-in-law. So yeah, it's a complicated question, and I think that history teaches us to look more skeptically at all governments, and all arms races, and all big military spending. But at the same time, and I'm not saying that this is what you're saying, but it's a position that I encounter sometimes in the world. But that does not lead me to say, and thus, screw Ukraine. Like it should just be part of Russia anyway. I don't think that's the position that Smedley Butler would have taken.
We probably actually don't have any more time. I'm sorry. Is there anything you want to? I know he will be here to talk afterwards.
And talk.
He's got a driver, so we'll get him another beer. But is there anything you want to finish with? I think what you said right there says a lot.
No, the last thing that I would say, and one of the things that I think is one of the big messages that I hope people take home from this book, is that the things that America does in the world, the things that we do to other countries, don't stay in those countries. They have a way of coming back. And one of the things, and I was finding this long before, or sort of, this book grew up over the course of the Trump presidency, and sort of little hypotheses that I had kept being confirmed until, essentially on January 6th, they were just confirmed beyond my wildest nightmares. That the wars that we fight, of extraction, of subjugation, in places like, most recently, Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Africa, and in Butler's lifetime in Latin America and in Asia, have a way of coming home, and imperialism has a way of coming home in the form of fascism and authoritarianism. And essentially, the operational way that this works is that once you, as a person, get comfortable with writing off people over there, and you say, those people don't count,
Those people don't have a right to make their own decisions about how they live. Those people don't have a right to make their own decisions about the form of government that they have, or the way in which their society is organized, or the food that they eat, or the things that they import or don't. And we can go and crush them and destroy them and burn them and torture them and do things like Abu Ghraib and the forever prison at Guantanamo. It's not a coincidence that that symbols like Guantanamo, which is the first place that Butler was deployed in 1898. It's the first sort of overseas chapter of this book. It's not a coincidence that on January 6th, you had people who were storming the Capitol and chanting for military tribunals and perpetuating a conspiracy theory in which Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton and all of the libs were going to be rounded up and put in Guantanamo. Because once you have created places in your own imagination, black holes in which you can throw people who you just don't think count fully as humans, ultimately, there's no limit to how far you are willing to go. And even if you personally think that there is a line that you're willing to draw for yourself, there's some other guy who probably has a big gun who is not willing to brook those kinds of niceties. And that was one of the things that that really narratively, tied this book up for me in Butler's day. I couldn't figure out how do you tie the business plot to this long career of racketeering, as he called it? How do you connect the business plot to the overthrow of governments in Haiti and Nicaragua and Honduras and the Philippines, et cetera? And it's like, then it just hits you like a bolt from the blue. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. You destroy democracy there, you destroy democracy here. You do whatever you have to do to profit there. You do whatever you have to do to profit and make sure that your friends profit here, as long as you think you can get away with it and as long as you think you aren't going to pay a price. And it's a lesson that I wish we could talk about in a historical vein, but it's a lesson that we are now being forced to relive and confront today in this country. And I hope, and what I can say is that in Butler's day, in Butler's time, in 1934, Butler saw through that, and he came out on, he came out, I hesitate to say things like the right side of history, because I don't think history has sides. But Butler saw through it, and he made the right call. He said, I'm not going to go through with this. I'm not going to do to my government what I did to all these other governments and all these other peoples elsewhere. And I hope that there are more people who are willing to make those same decisions today.